All right, so I'll go ahead and start the session. So my name is David Rocha. I'm a Partner Solutions Architect at AWS, and I work on the Alliance team, and I work closely with the SUSE team in bringing SUSE products to AWS. Today we're going to go over AWS Marketplace product codes, SUSE upgrades, and agreement amendments. And the reason that there's these three different topics, and if we look at the agenda, SUSE products, Amazon EC2 metadata, amendments for annual agreements and upgrade considerations, it's important that we cover Amazon EC2 metadata because it impacts really any instances that are running SLES or SLES for SAP that are being sold. You have to understand that metadata and how it's used to identify those instances. And so today we're going to cover that. Before we do, let's go ahead and let me briefly touch on the two products that AWS is currently reselling from SUSE, right? So we offer SUSE Linux Enterprise Server and SUSE Linux Enterprise Server for SAP. Now, SUSE does have other listings. They have Rancher, Prime, UVector, Prime, SLE Micro. There are other products that are published on AWS, but those are sold by SUSE and not sold by AWS. I'm highlighting these two specific products because I want to dive into the instance metadata quickly. When you launch a SUSE Linux Enterprise Server or a SLES for SAP server, you do have a SUSE-provided update infrastructure on AWS. And it is based on, you'll make a connection to that update infrastructure using the Cloud Region Server client. So it automatically connects to an update server, and you can receive your updates and patches through that. And that's really anytime you launch any of the instances through AWS. Additionally, if you purchase from AWS, and if you look at the two listings, you can see by AWS, Amazon Web Services, you're eligible to receive AWS premium support. And what that means is any kind of issues that you encounter, whether it's with Amazon services, AWS services, or SUSE services or issues, you contact AWS, and we'll work through to resolve those issues. If there's any need for escalation, bugs, issues with that, we work with SUSE and the SUSE engineering team in getting that over to SUSE so they can address that problem. Additionally, for customers who want to still maintain their SUSE premium support service where they want to be able to contact SUSE, you can absolutely do that. We do have a listing in the marketplace for that, but we also, if you already have a support engagement and you want to continue to leverage that, you can absolutely do that. There's no restrictions on that. So Amazon Elastic Cloud Compute, or EC2, is really our service that provides customers, instances. And I'll say instances, but they're virtual machines, right? So we often refer to them as EC2 instances, but it's essentially virtual machines. And any of the EC2 instances that are launched are always launched from an Amazon machine image. So an AMI has to be used to launch an actual EC2 compute service. And if there's any billing metadata associated to that AMI, to that machine image, Amazon machine image, it will be inherited by that EC2 instance. And this prevents the loss of, we'll say like a subscription. So if you launch SLES from a Amazon machine image and you launch it, you want to ensure that you have those subscription rights. And this is AWS's way of maintaining an identification for those instances. And looking at the AWS CLI, you'll see the AWS EC2 run instances and image ID. So the image ID is a requirement. There's not a way to launch an EC2 without an image ID. Now, the image can be a marketplace image. It could be an image that you created. It could be a golden image or a community image. It doesn't matter, but it does have to be an Amazon machine image, and you do launch instances based off those. Any questions? All right, so with AWS billing codes, so this is really how we're able to identify what a SUSE Linux Enterprise server is and what a SLES for SAP server is. I'm just going to use SLES and SLES for SAP for short. We're able to use that billing metadata to really identify those servers. And what SUSE does is they use that metadata to ensure that the right products have the right repos. So if I launch a SLES for SAP, there's a marketplace listing associated to it, and there's metadata that I use to launch that listing. SUSE will ensure that I have the correct repos, right, the repositories. And they do this both with SLES for SAP and SLES. Now, if we look at what is the difference between SLES and SLES for SAP? So SLES for SAP is an AWS Marketplace product. And when you're examining the cost of SLES for SAP or a marketplace product, you'll see a software cost and you'll see an infrastructure cost. But they are separate. It's not a bundled cost. You can quickly identify or easily identify what the software cost is and what the instance cost is. For SLES, it's an Amazon EC2 product. And I know that it's kind of native to AWS, and it's a bundled price. So when you're examining the price of SLES, you don't know what that cost is because it's a single cost that's included in that instance. And an easy way to differentiate what is an EC2 product versus what is not is a field called platform details. So with the platform details, if it's not an EC2 product, it'll have Linux, Unix, or some other value. With SLES, and there's others like Windows, Red Hat, it will actually have that platform detail value as whatever it is. And for SLES, it's SUSE Linux. So if you're looking at the metadata and you want to know, is this an EC2 product, it will define it as SUSE Linux. Below are some additional billing codes and billing fields for the marketplace and EC2 that we'll dive into. Before we do, I do want to show an example of the marketplace listing. This is a screenshot, and you can see where you're looking at an instance type. You're looking at the software per hour, and there's a software cost associated to it. And then you see the instance, the EC2 per hour. Now, this is on demand. It's not the annual cost or the annual subscription where you'll get a discount. But I wanted to highlight that it does show two different prices. So when you look at your AWS bill, you'll see a marketplace fee, and then you'll see an EC2 hour fee associated with your usage. And looking at, and you can see AWS pricing calculator is available, and you can look at the pricing for SUSE Linux Enterprise Server, and you'll see the on-demand hourly cost, and it's a bundled cost. It does not separate out the two. So the only way to compare it is if you were to look at like OpenSUSE, the cost of an OpenSUSE or just a straight Linux Unix box running without it being an EC2 product where there's no charge. Any questions so far? All right. So here is some AMI metadata. So this is from the image. So when you just do a describe images and you define the image ID, you'll retrieve a lot of metadata associated with it. I just took a snip of some of the metadata that we care about. And in this case, it's platform details, right? It's Linux, Unix for SLES for SAP. That lets you know it's not an EC2 product. There's not an additional cost associated with running that instance outside of that software cost. So that's where you'll have the product codes and the product code ID. I have X's on the product code ID. I could have probably put in the product code ID, but each SLES for SAP instance has a different product code ID because they are a different listing. So each AWS Marketplace listing has its own unique product code ID that's associated with the product code type, which is Marketplace. When you look at SLES, it's not going to have anything in product codes. It will have platform details as SUSE Linux, and the usage operation is run instances 000G. And that lets you know that it's an EC2 product with the platform details, and specifically the 000G is kind of a way that AWS tracks and shows how whatever instance is launched will inherit that information. So looking at an Amazon EC2 metadata, right? So if I do a describe instance, I will see within an instance, an actual instance, I'll see the product code ID and the product code type. So each instance inherits that information from that base AMI. And the same with SLES. It inherits the same data. And that data is immutable. We can't change it. So whatever you're starting as, whatever you use to launch that instance is what will be identified, or the instance will be identified as that product. Additionally, we have something called an instance identity document. So every instance you launch, it has a unique set of metadata associated with that instance. And you can actually do a curl and pull like that document ID. So if you wanted to validate what is this instance running, what's the account ID, the region, the availability zone it's launched in, all of that information is contained with that instance identity document. And that is also not something that can be changed. And as I said before, the Cloud Region Server client that's running on those instances actually makes that API call to pull that information as far as the marketplace product codes or the billing product codes. You have a question? So the question was, for the instance identity document, when you run that token curl, does it have to be run from the instance itself? It has to be run from shell. So yes, it has to be done from that instance. Any questions before I move on to the next piece, which is amendments for annual agreements. So this was announced May 30th, 2024. So for the AWS Marketplace, and specifically SLES for SAP, you can create an annual agreement and receive approximately a 70% discount versus hourly. And before it was you were committing that AMI agreement, like if I wanted to launch 10 M7i 4x large instances for SLES for SAP, I couldn't change it. I was committed to run SLES for SAP on those instances. It didn't really make sense. It was just the way that the billing platform had locked it down, and it didn't allow changes. But that was, of course, we added that feature on May 30th, 2024. And so now you can make those changes within the AWS Management Console. So if you start an annual agreement on January 1st through December 31st, I'm able to change instance types and without changing that contract term. So if I change an instance type in the middle of the term, I'm able to do that, and it's December 31st. If I want to add instances to that agreement, so if I have a rolling migration or I'm my environment's growing and I have this agreement and I'm like, well, I want to leverage and I want to save additional money for these new instances I'm launching, I can add them to that agreement. And we'll walk through a couple of scenarios. So these are some supported amendment scenarios. So in this case, I know that we don't have to read this, but if you go back and review, I want to be sure that the scenario is explained. I can change an instance type with the same cost, right? So if I'm running an M5 4x large and I have it as an annual agreement, and I decide to run an M7i 4x large because my system needs additional power, the price per performance, I should be able to change to that M7i 4x large. And at AWS, we're constantly releasing new instances, whether it's at reInvent, whether it's around Sapphire, we're always launching these new instance types. And so we want to give our customers the ability to change to those newer instance types to fit that workload without having to restrict them to that contract, to that agreement. So we definitely see that as a use case with our customers. We also want to give customers, if they're growing, so with SLES for SAP, there's essentially 3 different buckets of pricing. But in this case, we have an M5 X large running at the annual cost of $1,117.50. So if I need to increase the performance for that instance, if I'm running up against bottlenecks and I need to move to a different instance, I can do that. And I will increase the cost. So the cost will increase to $1346, but within the console, it will calculate that prorated amount. So the difference is $230 for calculation's sake. So halfway through that agreement, if I decide to change it, I'm only going to pay the prorated amount. So that would be $115 difference. And I can change to that instance type based off of it. I don't have to calculate it. It's all done within the console. So as you start adding the instances or the instance types, you'll see it reflected. So if I have an existing agreement, I can also add additional instances. So if my agreement is for 5 instances and I need to launch an additional instance, I can do that. There's no reason why we wouldn't allow our customers to kind of add a workload to that agreement. And the date doesn't change. And once again, it is prorated. And in this case, it's written out, but it is a prorated amount. So whatever you have left remaining on that contract will be the prorated amount for that instance. And it's really the software, right? So we're only talking about the software cost. If you're talking about compute, there's reserved instances, savings plans that allow customers to save on that. I could also change the quantity and the size of instances. So if I wanted to run a lot of smaller instance types, it's just looking at the actual value. So as long as you're not decreasing that contract value, you're able to make amendments and make changes. That's all AWS is looking at, is the committed value for the software cost. If you were to make changes, and let's say your infrastructure, your EC2 instances are at a lower price, we're not looking at that. It's only the software piece that we're looking at. Now, I know I mentioned it. I did want to add it in here. You cannot, an unsupported scenario for agreement amendments is changing an instance type where the overall contract is a lower cost. And in this case, a simple example, I have one instance. I decrease the instance size and the cost is lower, and I'm not going to be able to do that. So that I will be prevented. It'll be a grayed out option where I won't be able to amend that agreement within the AWS Management Console. Any questions on agreement amendments? All right. So talking about the upgrades for SLES and SLES for SAP and things that you have to consider. So any of the major and minor version, whether you're using Zipper with install SUSE migration for a major distribution, a major version change going from 12 to 15, or you're going from service pack to service pack, that works, right? There's no issues. There's repository considerations that you have to have, right? So you have to be either connected to the SUSE Public Cloud Update Infrastructure, SUSE Manager, SCC, or RMT. You have to be connected to those repositories in order to be able to connect. But that's not any different than what you would normally do on-premise, right? So at AWS, it's treated the same. Additional considerations. So we will get customers asking questions about EBS, right? Elastic Block Storage, Amazon Elastic Block Storage, because customers will encrypt it and they'll ask, well, when we're looking at SUSE documentation, it says you can't do it to encrypted storage. Well, in this case, it's done at the service level, so you can absolutely upgrade it with EBS encryption as long as it's done through the service. Also, if I were to upgrade from, say, 15 SP3 to 15 SP5, whether it's SLES or for SLES for SAP, the marketplace billing code doesn't change. Remember, it's inherited and it's immutable. So I inherited it from the AMI that I launched it from, and I can't change it. Even though I've launched it, even though I've upgraded it, the AWS Marketplace is not looking at that. It's looking at that field for AWS Marketplace product code. And it identifies that listing or that instance to that listing. It's not looking at that version. So whenever you're purchasing an annual agreement or any type or anytime you're purchasing an annual agreement, you have to understand what that marketplace billing code is. Because what you don't want to do is purchase it based off of the running instance and not based off of how AWS sees that. All right, so the billing codes, I just want to reiterate, they are inherited from the AMI, right, the Amazon Machine Image, and they're immutable. They don't change through the life of the Amazon EC2 instance. So where it started from, as you upgrade that instance to whatever SLES version you're using, that billing code is associated with it. We introduce AMI annual agreements to provide customers the flexibility to make changes to those instances in the middle of a contract and then in the middle of agreement. But remember, even if you upgrade your SLES for SAP environment, you still have to understand what listing is associated to that instance, because that's where you need to purchase with the correct listing. So if I make a SLES for SAP purchase, I need to be able to understand what that marketplace product code is and look at the listing, and you'll see that there is an attribute on that listing.